Good morning. First of all, happy birthday, Sherry. Our my co-chair for the last 17 years, I think. Yeah. Uh, Lynn Schiffhorst. Lynn grew up in Manhattan and attended Catholic schools for 16 years, later pursuing graduate studies in English at New York University. After teaching high school and college courses, Brooklyn College for 8 years, she moved to Florida. During the day, Lynn worked as a counselor for the state, and in the evenings, she frequented a coffee house in Winter Park where she immersed herself in European poetry and wrote her own poems. In 1987, Lynn married Jerry Schiffhorst and subsequently taught part-time at the University of Central Florida, where continuing her work as a mental health counselor. Now, for over 3 decades, Lynn has been a lecturer for the Elder Hostel program, known as a Rhodes Scholar, where she has shared her expertise in literature, history, art history, with all adult learners. We at the History Group at the University Club have been privileged to enjoy many of Lynn's lectures in the past, including topics as the presence of the Roaring Twenties, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, Small Men and Big Crisis, President Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan. And the last presentation last year was Joseph Brodsky, from Soviet dissident to U.S. Poet Laureate. Now, today her presentation will be on modern voices from Antiquity. So on behalf of the History Group of the University Club, my great pleasure to introduce to you Lynn Schiffhorst. Lynn?
Well, when I started here some time ago, about 17 years, I think, I stood for the entire talk. I don't do that anymore. So if I disappear suddenly, just look, I'm out here. I thought before I began, I would ask, Ovid mentioned that I went to Catholic college. And back in the old days, Latin was a requirement if you went to a Catholic school in both high school and in college. And I was going to ask, how many others anybody else here went to a Catholic high school, a Catholic college? Did you? Oh, you can do it without being Catholic. Yes, you can. This is true. It helps, but... As you know, a lot of the church services in the old days were completely in Latin, and you just followed along as best you could. But the poets that I wanted to say a little something about today, and I've been on a bit of a poetry evangelism drive for the past couple of years, because I think that is one thing that has really fallen by the wayside to a certain extent. And part of it is probably, in part, due to something that was said by Octavio Paz. He's a great Mexican poet and literary critic. And he said there are a lot of things in life, in art, that can be commercialized. He said art, for example, is super commercialized on a certain level. And he said even fiction is commercialized. Publishing houses are turning out whatever they think will sell. The literary quality of it isn't particularly of a very high concern, let's say that. But he said poetry is very hard to commercialize. And, yes, you can commercialize rhyming because that's done all the time in commercials for different products. But poetry is somehow exists outside the world in which we spend most of our waking hours. And I think that it's a relief, it's a pleasure to be associated with poets that we really like. And it also, I believe, does something mentally for us as well as emotionally, that your mind becomes more flexible when you're following poets around the world or around the room. And And even though the poets that I'm going to talk about today their names are not household names anymore. Virgil, to a degree, certainly is among educated people. Horace, much less so, and Catullus, not at all. But the three poets that I will say something about today lived in the same time period, and it's a little surprising that it is in the 1st century before Christ, when Rome was transitioning from a Roman republic to a Roman empire. And by the end of their century, it will be an empire. But since this is a history group, I would like to say something that a classic scholar said, that when you start reading these poets and you think about Italy, he said you tend to think that Italy at this time, in the 1st century before Christ, was full of Italians. It's a reasonable assumption, isn't it? You would think that. But that was not the case. Northern Italy was held by the Gauls for the most part, and the Gauls are a Celtic people. I'm not saying that they're close relatives to the Irish, but there is definitely a connection. Southern Italy was largely Greek. And in fact, today we think of Naples as a very overcrowded city in a very poor area of Italy. But at 2,100 years ago, Naples was the center of a very well-educated Greek population and a highly respected culture. So if you wanted to really, if you had literary aspirations as a writer, you would make sure to get yourself not only to Rome, but down to Naples, and where you would learn, what the Greek poets had done, and you would become very familiar with that. Well, the first person I'm going to talk about today is, in a way, he's almost a comic character. He's the oldest in terms of being the firstborn of these three, but they were all born very close together. Died young, and he is certainly the bad boy among the poets. The irony is that Catullus, who one classic scholar said is very hard to teach in a classroom if you're teaching his complete works, because you can be reading a lovely poem by him on one page, you turn over, and you see, if you know enough Latin, a poem filled with obscenities. And I don't know what the Latin equivalent is for the F word, but I assure you there's a great deal of it in Catullus. But the irony really is that the poems that he's well known for are clean. They're emotional, in the more relaxed sense, shall we say. And one of the I also don't want to neglect to mention this, that he was born in Verona. And for somebody who would become famous for his love poems, it's wonderful that he was born in the city that would become identified with Romeo and Juliet. We owe that to Shakespeare much later, but nevertheless, apparently there was something going on in Verona, it must be in the water, that produces, some very fine poetry. He was born to, all three of them were really born to well-to-do families, which is a big help if you're going to get an education and be known as anybody. That hasn't changed. That stays pretty steady throughout history. It really does. That doesn't guarantee that your work is going to be highest quality, but it certainly guarantees that you will be known. Let's say that. Well, Catullus says nothing about his parents. We don't know anything about them. That's not, of course, unusual. But he does say something about his older brother, and his older brother died at a fairly young age. He was traveling at the time that his brother died, and so he has to come back to make the sacrifices on his tomb and to say goodbye to his brother. And he wrote one of the simplest but most memorable poems to his brother, and it's one of the most famous in world literature as an elegy, a eulogy. It's very short. It's not long at all. But I remember reading it when I was in college a long time ago, and it stayed with me. It's very simple. He says, I'm going to read some of these poems twice, because I think it's very hard to catch something on a first reading. And so I'll give you a second reading as well. Through many nations and over many seas I traveled to pay this service, brother, with my tears, to lay these final offerings upon your grave and to your voiceless ashes speak in vain. Since fate has taken you from me, brother, poor brother, carried off before your time, let me satisfy the ancient, sad tradition, and do this sacrifice upon your tomb. Take it, and take my tears of love and mourning, and so forever, brother, ave atque vale. That's the Latin phrase for, if you want to be flippant, hello and goodbye, but if you want to be, deeply felt, it's hail and farewell. So we know that his brother allowed him, it was like a second father to him, and allowed him to play. Probably not the best thing, but you can't turn some people around. And Catullus would always be, a player. He was never serious. Through many nations and over many seas I traveled to pay this service, brother, with my tears, to lay these final offerings upon your grave, and to your voiceless ashes speak in vain. Since fate has taken you from me, brother, poor brother, carried off before your time, let me satisfy the ancient, sad tradition, and do this sacrifice upon your tomb. Take it, and take my tears of love and mourning. And so forever, brother, ave atque vale. The simplicity of it, it's like a sonnet. I mean, it's almost the length of a sonnet. But at the same time, if you would like me to say something about Latin meter, I'm not going to do it because it's a very complicated subject. And Latin grammar is also, in poetry, is also a tear your hair out experience. If you've ever tried to translate anything, it's much easier to translate prose than it is poetry, and that's particularly true in Latin. Now, being a playboy and never having any time for work, really, why work? Where you can manage somehow or another without doing that. Love affairs were his main concern, and his main love affair was with a woman called Clodia. Clodia was well known in Roman society, partly because her real name was Claudia, and Claudia meant that she belonged to the Claudian family, and that was, if any of you saw I, Claudius back in the 1970s, the British movie it wasn't a movie, it was a television series. It was very, very well done. And so she belonged to an important family, and which meant that when she got into trouble, it made headlines. And so we have headlines about Clodia. She changed it from Claudia to Clodia. But Catullus got involved with her. Very beautiful woman. You got the impression she was drop-dead gorgeous. And she knew it, and she had a great time with it. She was married to an older man who didn't live very long after his marriage. I wonder how that could have happened. Most people felt that she had a little hand in his, passing. But at any rate, it wasn't enough to generate all the scandal that she would generate later on. But Catullus falls in love with her, of course he would. And he's at a party, he sees her, she's with somebody else. She will always be with somebody else. I mean, that's almost the definition of your life with Clodia, is that she's going to be with you and then somebody else. And he didn't do very well with that. So, but in the beginning, he was kind, he was gentle and patient. And he wrote a poem that has a unique feature to it, in the sense that she had a little sparrow. And apparently that was the thing to do. Even Juliet, in Romeo and Juliet, mentions that she would keep Romeo as close to her as a wanton's sparrow, because the sparrow was held on a little thread and always stayed, with the person whose pet they were, if you can have a bird like that as a pet. At any rate, apparently you could. So he says, tell me, sparrow, you darling of my darling, whom she plays with and caresses at her breast, you who peck when she offers you her finger, beak out thrust as if you would bite that finger. Tell me this one thing. When that radiant star, meaning his girlfriend, turns toward you, her pleasant little playmate, to console her when she suffers and relieve her burning passion, could I play with you the way she does? Could you lighten the pain that breaks my heart? caused by her, was the idea. There aren't very many poems about pets in Antiquity, but this is one of two of them. Tell me, sparrow, you darling of my darling, whom she plays with and caresses at her breast, you who peck when she offers you her finger, beak outthrust, as if you'd bite that finger. Tell me this one thing. When that radiant star turns toward you, a pleasant little playmate, to console her when she suffers and relieve her burning passion, could I play with you as she does? Could you lighten the pain that breaks my heart? Now, he has another poem. There's a second poem to a sparrow. And the second poem, the same sparrow has died. And so this is a eulogy for the sparrow. You don't find that very often in Antiquity either, I can tell you. Weep, weep bitterly, Venus and Cupid. Weep, too, every sympathetic spirit. My girl Sparrow has left this life forever. Poor Sparrow, the darling of my darling, whom she loved like the apple of her eye. He was a sweetheart who knew his mistress as well as a daughter knows her mother. All day long he would never leave her lonely, hop, 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 everywhere about her, greeting her with his sweet and special chirp. Now he's flying in solitary darkness to that region from which there's no returning. Curse you, cruel and barbarous death, you swallow up everything that's pretty. And now you've massacred a pretty little sparrow. Yes, you're the one to blame that my darling's lovely eyes are swollen and red with weeping. So he asked the goddess and the god of love to cry. Weep, weep bitterly, Venus and Cupid. Weep, too, every sympathetic spirit. My girl Sparrow has left this life forever. Poor Sparrow, the darling of my darling, whom she loved like the apple of her eye. He was a sweetheart who knew his mistress as well as a daughter knows her mother. All day long he would never leave her lonely, hop, 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 everywhere about her, greeting her with his sweet and special chirp. Now he's flying in solitary darkness to that region from which there's no returning. Curse you, cruel and barbarous death, you swallow up everything that's pretty. And now you've massacred a pretty little sparrow. Yes, you're the one to blame that my darling's lovely eyes are swollen and red with weeping. Well, they get together, as you would imagine, Clodia and Catullus, for a while. He's one of her, her friends, and while they're having a good time together, and he believes in her and thinks she's wonderful, he says this is one of his most famous poems. In fact, it's one of the most famous in world literature, really. He gave her a nickname, which is not unusual, to cover up a real name. When he read the poem, of course, he put in her real name. But because she was very sensitive to music and to poetry, he gave her a nickname for the Greek poet Sappho. Now, today we think of Sappho simply as someone who loved women, but she was really famous much more as a poet. And so he calls her, because she lived on the island of Lesbos, he calls Clodia Lesbia. Let us live, my Lesbia, and love forever. All the gossip of grave and reverent elders, close your ears to it. It isn't worth a penny. Suns can go down and come back the next morning, but our brief day, once it's been extinguished, passes into a sleep that has no waking. So give me kisses, 1,000, then 100, one more 1,000, another 100, 1,000 again, 100 more, and after that, when we've got as many as we can, throw out the account books. Forget them, so no envious character can hurt us when he hears we have had so many, many, many kisses. Let us live, my Lesbia, and love forever. All the gossip of grave and reverend elders, close your ears to it. It isn't worth a penny. Suns can sink and return again the next morning, but our brief day, once it's been extinguished, passes into a sleep that has no waking. Give me kisses, 1,000, then 100, one more 1,000, another 100, 1,000 again, and 100 more. After that, when we've got as many as we can, throw out the account books. Forget them. So no envious character can hurt us when he hears we've had so many, many, many kisses. Well, she went on to give many, many, many kisses to many, many, many others. One of them, his best friend. Just, to really add to the knife. And finally, they had a breaking up, Clodia and the best friend, and she maligned him publicly, and he got Cicero to sue her. That's really going to the top. And Cicero, of course, took her apart limb from limb. But, despite the fact that Catullus went on being totally devoted to her, he then, of course, said a few well-chosen things about her. And he wrote a poem, this is just an excerpt from it, to two old friends. You two old friends who remain my friends, unlike that guy who went off with my girlfriend, take from me these words to my girl. A message short but unpleasant. Give her my goodbye, her and all her lovers, whom she hugs so close to her that she leaves their loins limp. So she goes on that way. And apparently that's pretty much a realistic description of how Clodia lived. If you think about what you knew about Messalina from watching I, Claudius, or just from your knowledge of history, that's pretty much how she lived. At any rate, he died young. He was either 30 or somewhere in his early 30s. Some will say 30, some will say 33. Very easy to do, of course, in those days. Now, when you come to the next poet, Horace, who was almost his age, but lived very differently. Horace was born in the south of Italy, Puglia, if you know where that is, that's the heel, and to a father who had been enslaved. And yet somehow or another he got himself out of slavery, put together enough money, moved up to Rome, took his little boy and got him the best possible education. He was very devoted to his little son. Horace grew up, of course, becoming a poet and well known, and at this point, the terrible civil wars that had raged throughout Italy, the history of Italy in that century is really a nightmare of people fighting one another. Then the victor takes all the land from the people who lost and gives it to his veterans, and everything is going around and around in a washing machine. Julius Caesar, of course, being one of the most outstanding in terms of keeping the pot boiling. But at times, we're beginning to move into a quieter period here. And so Horace, when he became a poet, he had something that everybody needs, really, especially in this period of time when there are no publishers. If you want to be known, it's a little like Renaissance Italy. In Renaissance Italy, you were in if you knew the Medici. If they were your patrons, you were pretty much made. And so there is a Medici, or what you'd call a Rockefeller today in Horace's time, whose name was Maecenas. Very wealthy man, and very, very much like Cosimo de' Medici in the sense that he had a feel for literature. And because Horace was outstanding, he gave him a farm to live on. And he gave him enough money to keep him going. Not a whole lot. Horace didn't want a whole lot. Horace was almost the prophet of the epitome of a modest way of living, and I'll say something a little more about that. But I did want to read one poem, one of his most famous and most translated, done when he was young, and even John Milton translated this in the 17th century, about a young woman that, a little like Catullus, he was with her for a while, but he's not doing that again. But where Catullus talks about limp loins, it's quite a line that he has there, Horace does something different. And he looks at this young woman, imagines himself looking at this young woman that he calls Pyrrha. And he says, "What elegant young man, drenched in effusive scent, is courting you, Pyrrha, in some pleasant arbor? For whom are you binding up in wreaths your golden hair, looking expensively simple? He now believes you to be all gold, always good-tempered, a real sweetheart, with no idea how often he will complain loudly of the black winds and storms that you can conjure up, but not for me any longer. Look at that wall. Do you see my dripping cloak up there? I've hung it up as a votive offering to the god of the sea, telling him I've taken my vow. I was on board with you once, Pyrrha, and I'm not volunteering for another shipwreck. That's a great one, isn't it? Been there, done that, not going back. So there are no limp loins, but he gets his message across. Okay. And then the next set of poems are really intended to promote his philosophy, which is, we could call it Epicurean, except Epicurean has taken a bit of a turn, and these days I think means something that's just pleasure-seeking. You know, just do whatever feels good. But it meant something a little more involved in the original time period here, that you struck a balance. You know, make sure to include pleasure in your life. But, but don't go all out for it. It's not about drowning in pleasure. But one of the themes, of course, that comes along right with that is that our lives are short. And we have to make the best we can. We have to do the best we can. And this is one of Horace's famous poems. He's writing to a young woman that he calls Lucanoe. Sometimes Greek names are a bit of a challenge, so I'll leave it out on this one. Don't ask, he tells her, because it's forbidden to know what end, meaning what death, the gods will have given you or me. And don't fool around with ancient astrology. It's better to take whatever Jupiter gives you, whether that's many winters or the one that's beating now against the cliffs, and that will be your last. Savor your life. Pour the wine. Don't indulge in extravagant hopes, because even while we're speaking, envious time has already stolen some life away from us. Harvest today, or pluck today, take it out of the ground, and trust in tomorrow as little as possible. So it's a little reminder that, things are great now, maybe. They may not be so great tomorrow. The harvest today, or the pluck today, is in the Latin usually translated differently, carpe diem. You've seen it on T-shirts, and usually it's translated as seize the day. But it doesn't mean anything as aggressive as grab it. What it really means is get the utmost enjoyment out of it. And so he says, I'll read it again, don't ask, because it's forbidden to know what end or death the gods will have given you or me. And don't fool around with ancient astrology. Some translators say, and don't fool around with Ouija boards. What he really says is Babylonian tables. And that's, old, sayings about what's going to happen if something else happens, that sort of thing. He said it's better to suffer whatever Jupiter gives you, whether that's many winters or whether the one that's beating now against the cliff will be your last. Savor your life. Pour the wine. Don't indulge in extravagant hopes, because even while we're speaking, envious time has already stolen some life away from us. Harvest today, and trust in tomorrow as little as possible. He also wrote poems that talked about how much people were spending and what a big show they were making in a way that he thought was ridiculous. And it reminded me, it was just last week in the Times, there was a columnist who said that I tried to find it, but I can't remember what particular she was talking about. Fashion, I think. She said, we have so normalized overspending that the virtue of modesty has retreated completely out of sight. And you can't even find it. And so Horace's version here, this is one of them. Before long, the estates of the rich will have fish ponds bigger than lakes, and they'll drown what few acres are left for the plow. Ornamental trees will drive out the elms. The elms in his day, and I think still are much shorter than American elms in Italy, and farmers train grapevines to grow over the elms. It's called marrying the grapevine to the elm. And he says the elms are going to be gone. You're going to have trees that don't do anything except look good. Sweet-scented flowers will bloom where olive groves once were. That's not how things were in the old days. The founders of the Roman Republic would have despised our ways. Their private homes were modest, with thatched roofs, and no one was ashamed of them. If anything was large, it was community property. And when men quarried marble, it wasn't for themselves, but for the gods. They built it into temples. So before long, the estates of the rich will have fish ponds bigger than lakes, and they'll drown what few acres are left for the plow. Ornamental trees will drive out the elms where farmers train their grapevines. Sweet-scented flowers will bloom where olive groves once were. The flowers look very pretty, but that you can't eat them, That's not how things were in the old days. The founders of the Roman Republic would have despised our ways. Their private homes were modest with thatched roofs, and nobody was ashamed of them. What was large was community property, and when men quarried marble, it wasn't for themselves, but for the gods. They made it into temples. There's another one of the pleasantest poems that Horace wrote has a phrase in it that has passed into current usage and has been for 2,000 years, but most of us don't recognize that it was Horace who originated it. He writes to a friend of his in this poem and says, "Licinius, don't spend your life going too far out into open water, and don't stay too close to the rocky shore. Whoever loves the golden mean doesn't end up living under a roof that's going to collapse or a mansion that everyone envies. The tallest pine shakes the most in the storm. The tallest tower falls with the loudest crash. Always expect reversals. Be hopeful in trouble and cautious when things go well." The golden mean is the expression that we use, and in Latin, the word for mean is mediocritas, which gives a misleading impression that has also taken a turn for the worse. But it means a balance point where you have both the good and the bad. You're living sensibly and reasonably. So because Horace was so well provided for and was able to do so much, I think if he had had to do some kind of job, we wouldn't have as many poems as we do. And he was very highly regarded by Augustus, who was the leading political figure toward the end of the century. Augustus was related to Julius Caesar by blood. He wasn't Julius Caesar's grandson, but he was the grandson of Julius Caesar's sister, and Caesar adopted him. So he was set up. And Augustus, of course, would rule for a long time and really begin the Roman Empire. He was a great friend of Horace, and even though Horace had been the son of a slave, which normally would have blocked him from company like Augustus's, Augustus forgave him because of his talent. And so Horace says, one of his last poems, "I have built a monument more lasting than bronze and higher than the pyramids." He's talking about his own poems. "No rain will ruin it, no wind will blow it away. I shall not completely die." That's one of his famous lines, "Non omnis moriar." I shall not completely die. The larger part of me will escape my funeral. As long as the high priest ascends the Capitoline hill, attended by Vestal virgins, men will continue to say that I, born in the land of a peasant people, was the first to bring Greek poetry into Latin. Melpomene, he says she's one of the muses, the muse of song, look kindly on the honors you have won for me and place on my head the garland of Apollo's laurel. Now, I built a monument more lasting than bronze is one of his famous poems, and that actually is relatively easy to read if you know the Latin vocabulary. But I shall not completely die. And as long as the high priest goes up the Capitoline Hill, the Capitoline Hill was one of the 7 hills on which Rome was built. And it had the temple, the best known temple of Jupiter. What it really is a symbol of eternity. So he's saying, I'll be famous for eternity. because of these poems, and they are very, very well done. Now, when he died, he left his estate to Augustus, and the emperor, and he asked to be buried next to Maecenas because they were, in close association. Now, I'm going to sit down to tackle Virgil because otherwise I'll be so stiff you'll be carrying me out to my car, so hold on for a minute. How many of you are familiar with the Aeneid? Virgil's, okay, I had a feeling that would be the case, that a number of you would be.
Do you need any more water?
Water is fine. What I need are knees. Some new knees, a little more knees. Okay. Excuse me, honey?
What century was Horace in?
Oh, all three of these are in the 1st century before Christ. Mm-hmm. And some of them knew one another. Thank you. I'm going to try to talk as loudly as I can for this. But when we get to Virgil, of course, we get to one of the most famous people in world literature. I will say that, speaking as a teacher, that the Aeneid is generally not as well liked by students as the Iliad or the Odyssey. It is the story of the founding of Rome, but and it is the Trojan War, which of course is the essence of the Iliad. But in the Iliad, there's a lot more activity and a lot less reflection. It's an earlier poem. The Trojan War the dates for the Trojan War. Now, we're entirely in the centuries before Christ. I don't want to forget to say that. The Trojan War goes way back, 3,000 years ago. It's usually given between 1184 and 1194. That's often the dates of it. It happened on the coast of northern coast of what today is Turkey, but the Turks wouldn't be there for thousands of years, and it was a very different ethnic group that lived there. The Trojans and the Greeks ended up in war because of a very well-known story, of course, the Judgment of Paris. And if you know that, you remember it pretty well. That in the upper world, where the gods and goddesses lived, they got along for the most part, except when they had titanic battles. But there was one goddess who was always unpopular, and she was called the goddess of discord. What a surprise that she would be unpopular. When the others gave parties, she didn't get an invitation. So when there was a wedding going on, an important wedding, she was the only one left out. And so she came up with her little scheme to get back at her, sisters and brothers, her cousins, the other gods and goddesses. And she had a golden apple made. She threw it into the wedding place, and it said, "For the most beautiful." Well, don't you know, that started an argument among the goddesses as to who fit that description best. It came down to 3 goddesses, Juno, of course, Hera in Greek, Aphrodite in Greek, Venus in Latin, and Athena, or Minerva in Roman. The 3 of them thought that they had really the best claim. So, what to do, what to decide. Well, they called on one of the Trojan princes, Paris, who had an eye for beauty, and let him pick which one of them should really have that golden apple. And he did decide, but he didn't decide based on which one was the most beautiful. He decided on which one gave him the most beautiful bribe. And so Juno said, "I will make you lord of heaven and earth under the gods and goddesses." He thought about it, wasn't interested. Athena said, "I will make you the head of Troy, and you will annihilate the Greeks." Not that interested either, really. And so Aphrodite, Venus, said, "I will arrange for you to have the most beautiful woman in the world as your wife." "I'll take that," he said. And so she did not mention to him, however, that the most beautiful woman in the world was already married. She was married to the king of Sparta. But she did arrange, of course, for him to have her, and he was able to carry her off from Sparta. Now, before she was married, every prince in the immediate area wanted to marry Helen, but her foster father, because her real father was Zeus, her foster father said, "I want to make sure that anybody who's chosen, whom I choose to marry Helen, will have the support of every other prince and king here once the decision is made. So they all think it will be me anyway, so yes, I'll vote for that. Well, it wasn't them. It was, the king of Sparta, Menelaus. And so after, he loses his wife, they are all in duty bound to support him to get her back. And that is the opening of the war against Troy. And so, but even though the Iliad and the Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, or recited it, shall we say, dates from about the 8th century. So the war was hundreds of years old by the time Horace came along with rumors of the war. It only lasted about 10 years. But when you come down another 800 years, 700 years to Virgil, he decides to tell the story of Aeneas, who is a Trojan prince and who escapes from the burning city of Troy and manages to found what will essentially become the Roman Empire. And so naturally he has, a very high standing. So the story begins with the Trojan War, and telling the story of Aeneas, Aeneas, in a way, is a very admirable person. And that word isn't used very much anymore, but he's very admirable. He's almost, if I may say the word, sinless. He does all the right things, and he does them for the right reason. So consequently, he's not usually considered as interesting as some of the crazy characters, from the Iliad. But nevertheless, he was somebody that obviously Virgil admired a lot, or he wanted to create a character who would be admirable. So, but what is interesting about to the modern reader about the Aeneid is not only the fact that he retells in capsule form the story of the Trojan War and how Troy lost the war. He has Aeneas tell the story as a flashback. Once he's saved, he travels away with his men. They have to go somewhere else to found a new city, a new Troy, if you want to call it that. And so some of the gods support him, other of the gods, of course, do not. But he ends up on the coast of North Africa at first, where in the city of Carthage, which is led by a woman named Dido, and she has brought her people there from the area of Tyre and Sidon in the Near East, because she was married to the king, and her own brother kills the king, takes it over, and bullies everybody, and she gets her own people out of there and to the area around Carthage. When Aeneas and his men get there, he sees her. She's very beautiful. She sees him. Of course, he's dazzling. And you can tell that a marriage is in progress. She's a widow. Why not? And as it turns out, he is a widow himself. But what Virgil did was something, I think, very modern. And if I can use a sort of a psychology term, a psychological term, Virgil comes better out of the war than Dido does because Aeneas has closure. And closure usually means that you have some healing from an earlier wound before the next series of wounds, attack you or come into you. And so when he tells Dido the story of the Trojan War, he tells her that he was running away from the war. He tells her how the city was invaded. And if you know the story of the wooden horse of Troy, that's exactly how the city of Troy was invaded. And the story is not told in the Iliad. Homer doesn't tell that story. It's a separate piece of mythology. But Virgil tells it, and he tells it through Aeneas, who lets Dido know that the war has gone on for almost 10 years. It's a war of attrition. They're wearing each other down. Everybody's miserable, but nobody's winning. And so Ulysses, who is the calculating brain on the Greek side, comes up with a brilliant idea, and that is a trick. So if you can't win by straightforward fighting, then sometimes you have to bluff the enemy into accepting a trick, and then he's vulnerable, and then you can do what you want to do. So he comes up with the idea that the Greeks should appear to leave Troy as though to say, we give up. We're not doing this anymore. But the ships pull away, but they don't go very far. They just sort of go around the corner and wait to see what would happen. And before they leave, however, he has woodworkers make a giant horse, huge horse. It's big enough so that he can hide a whole regiment of Greek soldiers inside the horse, and nobody knows they're there. And so he arranges for that to be left on right outside the walls of Troy, and he leaves one poor Greek behind to tell a false story to the Trojans. And this is brilliant, really, on Virgil's part, that the man who's left behind appears to panic, and says to the Trojans, when they see this giant horse, the ships are gone. The spy, for that's what he is, he says, "Oh, the Greeks have left, but to make sure they have a safe passage home, they've made this giant statue of a horse, wooden horse, and they dedicated it to Athena so that she would protect them. But they're sure that because it's Athena, who was always on the side of the Greeks, that the Greeks were sure that you, the Trojans, would destroy this horse, and in that way Athena would be against you and will bring you down." So they're so good, the Trojans. They take this poor lying soul in, give him a home, and they bring the horse inside the city. And then, of course, they open the horse, and out pours a flood of Greek soldiers who set fire to the city and start the killing. And that really is the end of the war in Troy. But while Aeneas has to leave, he has his father with him. He has his little son with him, and they're getting set to leave. He has his father on his back. He has his son by the hand. His wife is supposed to walk behind him, and all in a little closed group, he's going to do everything possible to get them out of there. But when he turns around, he's realized she's gone. So he leaves his father and his son, and he goes to search for her. And he doesn't find her, but he finds her ghost. She has been killed. And she tells him, "This is not your fault. This is the gods." And in fact, it is the gods, because that is exactly the kind of thing, that the gods do. They play sides. There's no question about it. They enter in, they save one hero, they sacrifice another hero. They can do whatever they want. And so Aeneas and his deceased wife, Creusa, have a heart-to-heart talk. And then, of course, she vanishes, and he has to go on his way and save his son and his father and all his men. So they go off, and they end up in Carthage, and the northern coast of Africa. And Dido is so enchanted with him. Now, she's a widow. Why not? But Venus, who is Aeneas's mother, believe it or not, real mother, decides that she has to make sure that Dido falls in love with Aeneas, because she wants him to protect him. She wants her to protect him and make sure that nothing happens while he's there. And so she takes away his little boy, Aeneas' little son, and puts her little son, Cupid, in his place, looking just like the little boy. And so when Dido goes up and puts her arms around the little boy, is Cupid, who drives his arrow of passion straight into Dido's heart. And so, then of course she's, deeply in love, and he's in love with her also, and he begins to think it wouldn't be a bad idea to settle down here. But the gods tell him he has to continue on. And so they end up, he has to leave Dido, and she takes it tragically, because unlike Aeneas, who has already had a conversation with his dead wife, her husband was killed, but killed by her brother. And so there's some guilt. If he had not married me, my brother would not have been able to kill him. And she had no chance to have any conversation with him. And so after Aeneas leaves, as he has to, he leaves her behind. He doesn't want to, and he tells her that. There's no question. The gods have determined he has to go to get to Italy. And he does, but she takes her own life. And so she is one of the great tragic figures in the Aeneid. They go on, of course, and he does get to Italy. His little boy grows up, founds a town called Alba Longa that today is Castel Gandolfo, which is the area where the Pope goes to have his summer home. during the hot months. And Aeneas survives. He is also able to go down to the underworld because he wants to have advice from his father. Now, his father is dead, but when he gets to Italy and he gets to and I'll end in a little while, I know that we're close to time, that when he gets to Italy on the coast, there is one of Apollo's prophetesses there, a Sibyl, and he asks her how he can get to the underworld to be able to have a conversation with his father and get some advice. And she gives one of the most famous lines there are several famous lines in the Aeneid that have come over into English. And she says, easy is the descent to Avernus. Avernus is a lake of poisoned water that leads down to the underworld. And what she's telling him, easy is the descent to Avernus. It's not really hard to get into the underworld or hell. The trick is what? To get back out. That's right. That's a lot harder to do. And so she tells him what he needs to have is to break off a piece of a golden bough from a golden tree, and that will be his passport to go in and to come back out again. And of course, while he's there, he sees Dido in the underworld, and he's full of tears. And he apologizes to her. He has no idea that she had taken her own life because, of course, no social media in those days, no CNN. He didn't know. So, but it makes him, in a way, the fact that he cries and apologizes to her, and it is not his fault. He, in a way, I was thinking last night before I fell asleep that he is, in some ways, Aeneas is a King Arthur kind of figure. I've never read that, but I was thinking, he's pure of heart. And everything he does, he's like the touchstone of the normal, sensitive response to events. And he's really very special. So he wins at the end of the Aeneid. He becomes the king of that area in Italy. And we don't know, much more about him than that. But because of the way Virgil has done the Aeneid, with a person so very special, and also because Virgil did one of his early poems, and I'm just going to read you a few lines from it. The first collection of poems that he published were called the Eclogues, and they're poems of praise. They're based on Greek models. But what he says is, and nobody can understand why he wrote this. I mean, there's been a lot of debate about this. But in the century after Virgil died, in the first century of Christ, it's used as looking forward to the birth of Christ. Now, that doesn't seem likely in the least, but it's easy to understand why the Christian philosophers and theologians thought that. Virgil writes, the last great age the Sibyl foretold has come. A new order of centuries is being born. The Virgin returns, and the reign of Saturn. A new generation is coming down from heaven. Lucina, he says, who is the goddess of childbirth, look with favor on this child by whom the age of iron is giving way to a golden age. This child will share in the life of the gods, and he will be ruler of a world made peaceful by his merits. Now it almost cries out to be interpreted in a Christian sense, by Christian philosophers. And consequently, when the next great epic writer comes along, Dante, in the late 1200s, early 1300s, and he puts his little character, Dante, he uses his own name for the character who's stuck in a dark wood midway through his life. The person who helps him through the Inferno and through the Purgatorio, all three places in a Christian view of the afterlife. You have the Inferno, you have hell, you have purgatory, where people who are going to heaven have to get a cleanup job first before they're fit for heaven, and then paradise itself. But when Dante wakes up as his little self in his dark wood, the person who comes to lead him through the Inferno and the Purgatorio is Virgil. Virgil's very wise. He's in the underworld himself. He belongs in limbo. But he really helps little Dante, as I call him, not the poet, but the character named Dante, that Dante uses to go through the afterlife. And he's very much like a tutor. He teaches Dante what he's seeing when he doesn't understand what the structure is of what he's seeing. In a way, he's also a little like a mother. When little Dante, the pilgrim, gets distracted because there's a lot going on in the Inferno, for example, and he pays attention to something of no importance. Virgil reaches over, sort of grabs him like a mother grabbing a little boy by his rompers, and pulls him back and says, "That's not important. We're going on over here." And then when it comes time for them to leave the Inferno, Virgil picks up Dante, puts him on his back, and carries him up into the Purgatorio. And he stays with Dante through the Purgatorio right up to the top. And of course, then he can't go on into heaven because he's, a pagan. Nice pagan, nice guy, but, he doesn't have the passport. So he goes back to limbo, and, little Dante is carried on to the paradise by saints. The saints take the place of Virgil. So I can see a question back there.
Just a comment. I read a little bit of Dante, and what strikes me about Dante is the fact that they had the rules, and the rules are that if you live before Christ, you literally cannot get into heaven.
Yeah.
You're stuck in the uppermost circle of hell, which is kind of hell's suburbs.
I was just going to say the suburbs.
Yeah,
that's
it's hell's
right.
suburbs. It's not quite so bad
It's
as
very well landscaped.
lower levels, but
there's no pain.
yeah. But the other thing being that the rules are so strict that if I remember correctly, even the prophets, the Jewish prophets, were stuck in hell and had to be physically removed from hell, because they by the rules they could not
Right.
since they lived before Christ, they could not be in heaven.
Right, no matter how good they were.
No matter how good they were.
That's true. That is true. Yeah.
Thank you. More questions?
Thank you so much for the talk. It's a subject that I knew nothing about, but I found it extremely interesting, and your presentation was really first class, very informative and enjoyable. But the question I would like to ask you is this. You referenced Augustus, the Emperor Augustus Caesar. Of course, he'd been Octavian before he became Augustus, Caesar's nephew. But you had mentioned that he took on Horace. Almost, he became his benefactor.
Yes.
I'd like you to comment, because I did read once somewhere that Augustus, even as the emperor, lived a pretty simple life. That even though he was surrounded by wealth and glory, of course, of the empire, in his own personal attire, he was very simple. He would wear homespun wool of a peasant. He would oftentimes be seen begging on the steps of the palaces outside Rome for charity, which he would then give out to the people once he returned back to the safety of the palace. And so the question that I have to ask you is this about that. If that was the case, did that in a way kind of protect Horace from any kickback for his clearly satirical poetry, which probably in many ways might have offended many of the aristocrats in Rome?
Well, you mean by complaining about overspending? Well, thank you. I didn't remember at all that Augustus had lived a very simple life. I didn't remember that. I mean, in the middle of splendor, the splendor that belongs to his office, but he personally lived in a way that was just basic. And that I didn't know. I didn't remember that at all. So thank you for saying that. I didn't know that. I should also say, by the way, that